Of course, here's a compelling introduction for your YouTube video story. It started as just another quiet afternoon at Westwood Academy. Kids ran across the playground, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. Parents stood in clusters, chatting as they waited to pick up their children. But in the midst of this everyday scene, one woman's eyes narrowed as she spotted something, or rather, someone, she didn't think belonged. A tall black man stood near the front of the school, dressed sharply in a navy blue suit. He had a calm and confident presence, casually watching over the students as they played. But to her, none of that mattered. She didn't recognize him, and in her mind, that was enough of a reason to be suspicious. She marched over, her heels clicking against the pavement, her face tight with indignation. Without hesitation, she squared her shoulders and pointed a finger at him. "Excuse me, sir, but you can't be here," she said, her tone laced with accusation. "This is a school, and we don't allow strangers to just wander around." The man, who had been watching a group of students wrap up their game of basketball, turned his attention to her. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by her aggressive approach. But instead of reacting with frustration, he simply smiled, a polite but knowing smile. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am," he said, his voice steady and professional. "But I can assure you I have every right to be here." Her eyebrows shot up. That wasn't the answer she expected. Folding her arms, she gave him a once-over, her suspicion only deepening. "Oh, really?" she scoffed. "And who exactly are you?" For a brief second, he considered playing along, letting her assumptions unravel naturally. But before he could speak, she pulled out her phone. "I don't know what you're doing here, but I'm calling the school office. We take security very seriously, and I'm sure they'll want to know why a strange man is lurking around." A few parents nearby turned to watch, sensing the tension in the air. The man exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to shake his head. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small but powerful enough to shift the entire moment, his ID badge. As he held it up, the woman's eyes flickered to the name printed in bold letters. Her face, once so full of righteous authority, suddenly went pale. Dr. Jonathan Reed, the badge read. Principal. Her mouth fell open, but no words came out. And just like that, the confrontation took a turn she never saw coming. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The woman's grip tightened around her phone as her eyes darted between the ID badge and the man standing before her. Her lips parted, but no words came out. It was clear she was scrambling for an explanation, trying to make sense of the situation she had just created. Dr. Jonathan Reed, however, remained calm. He had seen this type of reaction before, many times, in fact. He had spent years working in education, climbing the ranks, earning his doctorate, and dedicating his life to helping students succeed. But still, encounters like this were never easy. The parents nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the awkwardness unfolding before them. A few whispered to each other, recognizing Dr. Reed from school meetings and events. Some of them had even spoken to him before, praising the changes he had made since becoming principal. Yet this woman, who clearly hadn't done her homework, had jumped to conclusions before even asking the right questions. Dr. Reed slowly tucked his badge back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. He could see the woman's mind racing, searching for a way to justify her actions. "Well," she finally said, clearing her throat, "it's just, I didn't recognize you. You have to understand, these days we have to be extra careful about who's around our children." Her voice had changed, softer now, almost as if she wanted to shift the blame onto him for not being more recognizable. She wasn't apologizing. Instead, she was trying to save face, to make herself the concerned protector rather than the person who had just humiliated herself in front of an audience. Dr. Reed simply nodded, choosing his words carefully. "I understand the need for safety," he said, "but assumptions can be dangerous, don't you think?" The woman swallowed hard, but before she could respond, a small voice cut through the tension. "Dr. Reed." A young boy came running up, a bright smile on his face. It was one of the students, Malik, a third grader who had struggled with reading at the start of the year, but had been making great progress. Without hesitation, Malik threw his arms around Dr. Reed's waist in an excited hug. "Did you see me on the swings? I went so high today," he beamed. Dr. Reed chuckled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I did see that. Looked like you were flying." The woman's face drained of color. She glanced around, noticing how others were watching her now, not with agreement, but with disapproval. The realization sank in. She had misjudged everything. Yet, she still wasn't ready to admit it. Dr. Reed gave Malik a warm smile before the boy dashed back to the playground, completely unaware of the tension between the adults. The innocence of children had a way of cutting through moments like this, but the woman still stood frozen, her fingers gripping her phone like it was some kind of lifeline. She glanced around again, noticing the way parents were exchanging looks, their eyes flicking between her and Dr. Reed. Some were whispering, and she could feel the weight of their judgment. It was a stark contrast to the self-righteous confidence she had felt just moments ago when she had stormed over, convinced she was doing the right thing. Dr. Reed didn't move. He simply watched her, giving her the chance to say something, anything, to acknowledge what had just happened. But instead of an apology, she let out a forced laugh, an awkward sound that didn't match the discomfort on her face. "Look," she said, folding her arms. "This isn't personal. It's just, you know how things are these days. You can't be too careful." Dr. Reed kept his expression neutral, but inside, he felt a familiar frustration creeping in. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned his presence in a place where he belonged. He had been through it before, mistaken for a janitor at the school he ran, assumed to be a visitor instead of the leader. But what bothered him wasn't just her assumption. It was the way she refused to take responsibility for it. Before he could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Is everything all right here?" Mrs. Patel, one of the school's most active PTA members, approached with a concerned look. She was a no-nonsense woman who had worked closely with Dr. Reed on several school initiatives. The moment she saw his face, she relaxed, but when she noticed the tension between him and the woman, her expression hardened. Dr. Reed nodded. "We were just having a discussion about who does and doesn't belong on school grounds." There was something in his tone, calm but pointed, that made the woman shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Patel turned to her, recognition dawning on her face. "Oh, I remember you. Your son just transferred here, right?" The woman nodded quickly, as if relieved to change the subject. Yes. I'm just being careful, you know. Making sure everything is safe." Mrs. Patel raised an eyebrow. "Safe from the principal?" The woman opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face flushed, and she glanced at Dr. Reed, who was still standing patiently waiting. For the first time, doubt flickered across her expression. She had been so sure of herself before, so certain that she was in the right. But now, faced with the truth, she wasn't sure what to do next. The woman's face remained tense as Mrs. Patel's words hung in the air. She was cornered, and she knew it. A few parents had inched closer, pretending to check their phones or watch their children, but their stolen glances told the truth. They were paying attention. The weight of their silent judgment pressed down on her, making her shift uncomfortably. Dr. Reed didn't move, his posture still composed, his expression unreadable. He had learned over the years that silence could be just as powerful as words. And right now, he wasn't going to make this easy for her. He wasn't going to let her brush this off as a misunderstanding without acknowledging what had really happened. The woman cleared her throat, trying to gather herself. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble," she said, her voice slightly defensive now. "I was only looking out for the kids. You can understand that, can't you?" Dr. Reed tilted his head slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Looking out for the kids," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me, what was it exactly that made me look like a threat? Was it my suit, my badge, or something else?" A flicker of panic crossed her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She knew what he was asking, and she didn't have a good answer. She looked to Mrs. Patel for help, but there was none. The other woman only folded her arms, waiting to see how she would respond. The tension thickened. Parents exchanged glances. Even some of the older students, standing by the bike racks, had begun to sense something serious was happening. The woman let out a short, nervous laugh. "You're twisting my words," she said quickly. "That's not what I meant." Dr. Reed nodded slowly. "Then help me understand what you did mean." Her fingers tightened around her phone again, as if holding onto it might somehow help her escape this moment. But there was no escape. Not this time. Before she could say anything, a voice cut through the air. "Mom." A young boy stood nearby, shifting from foot to foot. His backpack hung off one shoulder, his face uncertain. It was her son. He had seen everything. For the first time, the woman looked truly shaken. The confidence she had moments ago, the certainty that she was in the right, had disappeared. Her son's eyes flickered between her and Dr. Reed, his expression filled with confusion. She swallowed hard, her breath unsteady. Because now it wasn't just about her. Now someone who mattered was watching. For a moment, everything was still. The woman's son stood frozen, his wide eyes darting between his mother and Dr. Reed. He didn't understand everything that had just happened, but he could tell something was wrong. His mother's face was tight, her knuckles white around her phone, and Dr. Reed, who looked nothing like the person she had just accused him of being, stood there with a calm patience that somehow made everything worse. The woman's breath hitched, her mind racing for a way out of this. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down like an unbearable heat. But before she could respond, another voice entered the conversation. "Is there a problem here, Principal Reed?" A tall man in a grey blazer approached, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Mr. Dawson, the superintendent of the district. His sudden appearance sent a fresh wave of panic through the woman's face, but for Dr. Reed, it was just another layer of the moment unfolding before him. Dr. Reed turned to face him, his expression still measured. "Nothing I can't handle," he said smoothly, though his voice carried the weight of everything unsaid. Mr. Dawson's sharp gaze shifted to the woman, who was now standing stiffly, her son gripping the strap of his backpack. The superintendent knew exactly what had just taken place. He had caught enough of the exchange as he walked up, but he let the silence stretch, waiting to see what she would say. The woman finally forced out a shaky breath. I didn't know who he was," she said, her voice cracking slightly, trying to keep her dignity intact. "I was just being cautious." Mr. Dawson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he turned to the boy. "What's your name, son?" The boy hesitated, glancing at his mother, then back at the superintendent. "Liam," he said quietly. Mr. Dawson gave a small, reassuring nod. "Liam, do you know who Dr. Reed is?" Liam shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. "I think so," he mumbled. "We talked about him in class." The woman's face drained of color. She had made a scene in front of the very man her own child had been learning about in school. Mr. Dawson's expression didn't change, but his words came slow and deliberate. "Dr. Reed has been leading this school for the past 3 years. He's responsible for some of the biggest improvements we've seen. Better programs, higher test scores, even safer school grounds. So tell me," he turned back to the woman, his voice steady but pointed, "what exactly were you trying to protect your son from?" The question landed with a weight that seemed to make the air around them heavier. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out, because deep down she knew the truth, and now so did everyone else. The woman opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Mr. Dawson's question hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of disapproval and quiet expectation. Even Liam seemed to sense the shift, his small hands tightening around the straps of his backpack. Dr. Reed stood motionless, his calm gaze never leaving the woman's face. He wasn't looking for an apology. He had been in situations like this enough times to know that some people never truly admitted when they were wrong. But the moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was no escaping it. The woman finally let out a shaky breath. I just didn't recognize him," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't trying to." She stopped herself, knowing that no explanation would change what had happened. Liam looked up at her, confusion in his young eyes. "But Mom, he's the principal," he said softly, as if trying to make sense of why she had treated Dr. Reed like a stranger who didn't belong. The words stung more than anything else. For the first time, the woman looked truly shaken, not by the crowd, not by the superintendent's presence, but by the quiet disappointment in her own son's voice. Dr. Reed exhaled, letting the moment settle. Then, with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout the encounter, he looked at Liam. "It's okay," he said gently. "We all learn from moments like this." Liam gave a small nod, still uncertain but clearly relieved that Dr. Reed wasn't angry. The woman, however, remained still, her face tense. It was clear she wanted this conversation to be over, to slip away and pretend it never happened. Then, just as she turned slightly, preparing to leave, another unexpected voice broke through. "Mrs. Cartwright." A teacher approached from the school entrance, looking puzzled. "Oh good, you're still here. I was just heading out to find you." The woman turned sharply, eager for a distraction. "Yes?" she asked, a little too quickly. The teacher smiled politely. "I just wanted to confirm the meeting with Dr. Reed tomorrow. You signed up to discuss Liam's placement in the advanced reading program, right?" The woman's face paled. A few parents stifled quiet gasps. The irony was impossible to ignore. After spending the last few minutes treating Dr. Reed like an outsider, she had unknowingly been scheduled to meet with him about her own son's academic future. Dr. Reed gave a small, knowing smile. "I'll see you in my office tomorrow," he said, his voice calm but firm. The woman swallowed hard, nodding stiffly before turning away, her pace quickening as she led Liam toward the parking lot. The crowd slowly dispersed, whispers fading into the background as people returned to their routines. Mr. Dawson clapped a hand on Dr. Reed's shoulder. "You handled that well," he said. Dr. Reed gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful. "I've had practice." He turned toward the school building, his mind already shifting back to the work that truly mattered, his students, his staff, and the future he was building at Westwood Academy. Because no matter how many obstacles came his way, nothing would change his place here. He belonged. As Dr. Reed walked back toward the school building, he took a deep breath, letting the cool afternoon air settle around him. The playground was still filled with laughter, kids running across the grass without a care in the world. The incident from earlier hadn't affected them, and that was how it should be. Mrs. Patel caught up to him, her expression a mix of admiration and frustration. "I don't know how you stayed so calm back there," she said, shaking her head. "I was ready to say something, but you handled it better than I ever could." Dr. Reed chuckled softly. "It's not about proving a point," he said. "It's about making sure people walk away thinking differently than when they arrived." She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. Some people would never change, but moments like these had a way of leaving a lasting impact, especially when they involved their own children. As they reached the steps, Malik ran up once more, his face glowing with excitement. "Dr. Reed, are you coming to the classroom later? Ms. Johnson said we get to show our projects today." Dr. Reed smiled, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eager gaze. "I wouldn't miss it," he said warmly. Malik grinned and ran back inside, and for a moment, Dr. Reed just watched, reminded of why he did this work in the first place. The challenges, the misunderstandings, even the moments of conflict, all of it was worth it when he saw his students thriving. As the parking lot emptied, Mrs. Cartwright's car pulled away. Through the rear windshield, Dr. Reed caught a glimpse of Liam in the back seat, staring out the window, deep in thought. Maybe today had planted a seed, one that would grow into something better. Dr. Reed turned back toward the school, his purpose unchanged. He had a meeting to prepare for, students to guide, and a future to build. Because no matter what, he wasn't going anywhere. This was his school, and he belonged here.